Tonight, Prof Manu will share his research on the learning sciences and productive failure and how these ideas translate into a classroom setting. He will also elaborate on the major findings, the impact of such interventions, and how it can change the future of learning and education.
What does this mean for learning? What does it mean for teaching? First job of teaching is actually not to tell them, not to teach. It's actually to prepare the novice to see.
Professor Kapur's research has made great impact locally and internationally.
By designing deliberately for failure initially and early on and engaging in that actually reduces the likelihood of failure when it really counts because you're learning better. And that's a very powerful argument. So the idea is not so much that you become an expert in failing. The idea is that you become an expert in exploring the boundaries of your knowledge and what you can do with it. And then failure is simply a byproduct.
Through sports for over 30 years. The Society also maintains strong ties with several regional alumni associations through the annual ASEAN University Alumni Friendship Golf Classic. In the spirit of giving back to the community, the Society regularly organises festive gatherings and parties for the elderly and disadvantaged children. Groceries on Wheels has been an annual event on the Society's calendar since 2010. Members come together to deliver basic necessities to the less privileged in our community. Our outreach activities also include home visits, which allow members to befriend the beneficiaries and bring smiles to many through music and songs. As the Society developed and expanded, it has always valued the strong ties with its alma mater. Through the years, the Society has pledged financial support to benefit students and the university. In 2004, the Society contributed $20 million towards the symbiotic project of building an alumni complex with NUSS. This shared space allows students, faculty and graduates to meet and foster lifelong relationships. The Society continues its annual pledge of $250,000 to the Alumni Bursary Fund, which provides support to financially challenged undergraduates to complete their studies. As part of SG50 celebrations in 2015, the Society raised a total sum of more than $2 million in support of the NUS Alumni Bursary Fund. The Society's annual gift provides seed funding for the campaigns, together with the schools, faculties, residential halls and other alumni bodies. The collective amount raised to date since the start of the campaign in 2014 is over $16 million before government matching. The Society's commitment to better the conditions of the less privileged is not limited by its financial endowments. Since 2012, the NUSS NUS Mentorship Program has benefited over 700 NUS students by connecting them with mentors who provide them professional and industry guidance. When the Society first started, it did not even have a home to call its own. This is our way of giving back. As a premier graduate club and the largest alumni association in Singapore, NUSS strives to uphold our rich heritage while continuing to support our alma mater and the wider graduate community.
A very good evening and a warm welcome to the NUSS Professorship Lecture. My name is Teck Wee, Co-Chair for Intellectual Pursuit and Lifelong Learning Subcommittee. and I'm delighted to take you through this evening's session. Tonight's session is unique as it is our first ever hybrid event with a limited audience size on site and is live streamed. It is our honor to have Professor Manu Kapur as NUSS visiting professor to share with us on the topic, the future of learning. May I now invite Mr. Edward Tay, NUSS President, for the welcome remarks. Mr. Tay, please.
Thank you, Teck Wee. Professor Manu Kapur, NUSS Professor 2020, and Professor and Chair of Learning Sciences and Higher Education at ETH Zurich, Switzerland. Associate Professor Peter Pang, Master of the NUS Residential College 4. Dr. Patricia Shen, Assistant Professor, Department of Psychology and Deputy Director, Institute for Applied Learning Sciences and Educational Technology of the NUS. NUS invited guests, NUSS Management Committee members, fellow NUSS members, ladies and gentlemen. A very good evening to all of you, and thank you for taking the time to join us in this lecture. For those who are here for the first time, a very warm welcome to you. As part of NUS's contribution towards the development of meaningful interactions with its alma mater, through academic pursuit, NUSS established the NUSS Professorship in 1996. It had an endowment of $1.5 million and has seen NUS appointing 22 visiting professors, and just recently, a full-time chair professor as well. The lecture seeks to enable distinguished faculty, often visiting professors at NUS from around the world, to share knowledge with the NUS community and the general public. The lectures, unfortunately, took a hiatus last year for obvious reasons. As I think we all know that there was restrictions in movements. I don't think the NUSS professor could even have made his way to Singapore. And but with the easing of these restrictions, I am pleased that we have resumed these lectures on our calendar. It is also the first time that this lecture is being done in a hybrid manner. It is done both physically, where all of you are present, and I welcome all of you again. And it's also made available to a wider audience through Zoom. There are over 500 participants comprising of NUSS members, NUS academia, and undergraduates and members of the public who have registered to watch tonight's lecture either here physically or via Zoom. I am pleased to extend a warm welcome to our speaker, NUSS Professor Manu Kapur. Proudly, although he comes from Switzerland, the good news is that he is proudly a Singaporean. He, as I highlighted earlier, he's Professor and Chair of Learning Sciences and Higher Education at ETH Zurich, Switzerland, which is one of the world's leading universities focused on science and technology. There, Prof Manu directs a future learning initiative which gathers more than 20 professors from 10 departments to advance research on the science of teaching and learning and translate it into practice at the university. Our moderator for this evening is Dr. Patricia Chen, an assistant professor with the NUS Department of Psychology and also Deputy Director of the NUS Institute for Applied Learning Sciences and Educational Technology. Before I introduce the session, it would be remiss of me to not to thank two other persons. One is Professor Peter Pang for hosting our NUSS professor at the Residential College 4. And another that he reminded me is very important that I thank. And that is his predecessor as master of our Residential College 4, Professor Lakshmi Narayanan Samavedam, whom most of you would have addressed as Prof Laksh. Prof Laksh is the person instrumental in bringing Prof Manu to Singapore, and we extend our appreciation to you. Tonight, Prof Manu will share his research on the learning sciences and productive failure and how these ideas translate into a classroom setting. He will also elaborate on the major findings, the impact of such interventions, and how it can change the future of learning and education. His research has been adopted by our MOE, the Singapore Ministry of Education, for wide-scale redesign and implementation in the curriculum and pedagogy of pre-university mathematics, particularly in statistics. This underscores his ability to build a sustainable interdisciplinary research program and work with multiple stakeholders. And for many like me who have school-going children, I hope that you will find this session an enriching and stimulating one. Have a pleasant evening ahead, and without further ado, I will hand you back to our moderator. Our MC for the evening, Teck Wee.
Thank you, Mr. Tay. May I now invite our moderator for this lecture, Assistant Professor Patricia Chen from the Department of Psychology in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, Deputy Director of Institute for Applied Learning Sciences and Educational Technology, to introduce our speaker. Prof, please.
It is my absolute honor and pleasure to introduce Professor Manu Kapur, who holds the Professorship for Learning Sciences and Higher Education at ETH Zurich in Switzerland, where he also directs the Future Learning Initiative. Professor Kapur has an illustrious career in academia, starting out with a doctoral degree in the science of learning with a specialization in instructional technology at Columbia University in the United States. He also holds 2 master's degrees, one in applied statistics from Columbia and another in education from the National Institute of Education here in Singapore. Since then, he has held positions at the NIE, where he served as head of the curriculum in the Teaching and Learning Department, as well as head of the Learning Sciences Lab. He was also a professor of psychological studies at the Education University of Hong Kong prior to moving to Zurich, where he currently lives. Professor Kapur's research has made great impact locally and internationally. As a scientist, he has published in some of the top journals in learning and cognitive science, such as the Journal of Educational Psychology, Educational Psychologist, Learning and Instruction in Computers and Education, and more. But the impact of his scientific findings go far beyond the walls of our ivory towers. Professor Kapur has worked closely with the Singapore's Ministry of Education to redesign its pre-university mathematics curriculum at scale. His work on productive failure, which he shall share today, has touched the lives of many students in our schools across Singapore. Professor Kapur is a highly sought after speaker at high profile conferences and events around the world. He has given invited talks and served on panels such as the Times Higher Education and World Academic Summit, the World Economic Forum, the International Early Conference, and the TEDx Lugano, and more. We are incredibly delighted and honored to host Professor Kapur to give this NUSS Professorship lecture. Please join me in welcoming him to the stage.
Testing. All right. Good evening. Thank you, Patricia, for such a generous introduction. That was the sanitized version. I will tell you the real true story. I wanted to be a football player. I became an engineer in the process. Not a very good one. Then I joined a startup and a consulting firm, which I quit. It didn't work out. Then I became a math teacher. I really liked it, but I wasn't particularly good, I think. And then I was touching 30. Having tried football, engineering, startup, teaching, nothing in the real world worked. So I decided what any rational person would do. I became an academic. That is the true story. Everything else is bells and whistles, right? But thank you, NUS, thank you, NUSS, for this incredible honor. I'm very delighted to be here. It's always good to be back home in Singapore. In spite of these times, I'm glad I was able to travel. And I've had one of the best conversations that I've had in the past year. I'm really delighted also that this would be the first time since the pandemic started that I'm actually giving a lecture in person. So that is quite amazing. And what better place than NUS? No. So thank you very much indeed. Now I'm told this is a general diverse audience, so I've tried to prepare my talk in a way that is non-technical, not complex. So I will simplify things so that I can communicate some of the messages that I want to, right? But in the trade-off is that I will lose some of the complexity and the technicalities and the nuances, right? Okay. So what I hope to do today is to talk about the future of learning, but to understand the future, we must first understand a little bit of the history, where we're coming from. I'll start with some of the big ideas. This is a standalone component, okay? Just by these big ideas, I hope that will change the way you think about teaching and learning. Then I'll share some of the work that I've done, my research itself on productive failure, that tries to take some of these big ideas and put them into tractable solutions in the classrooms. Okay, so I'll share some of the findings from there. And then we will move into what I'm currently involved in, the future, how we think about the future in learning and education. All right? So let's start with the big ideas. The first, before we even talk about the big ideas, let's just talk a little bit about what is learning, right? And when you think about learning, I think of it at multiple levels. There's the neural level, there's the cognitive, social, cultural. So if you think about the neural level, you can think of learning as synapses, synaptic interaction. They happen very quickly, very fast, on a very narrow time scale. Right? You can also think of learning as knowledge acquisition, which this is the mode that we are most used to talking about, what you acquire, the knowledge that you have, the skills that you have. We focus a lot on this. But there's more to learning. All learning is embedded in social activity. So how we come to participate in social activity, how we work with others, teamwork, collaboration, these are also important aspects of learning. We have to learn to do these things. Right? And finally, there's enculturation. How you come to be the way you are, your values, your ways of thinking, your ways of being, your dispositions, your identity itself. Not in some simplistic manner, but in a plurality of identities that we enact every day, from work, family, friends, and so on and so forth. So there's a whole spectrum in which we can define learning. And depending on where you are in this spectrum, you think about learning, you research learning, you practice and design for learning in different ways. But there are two things that are critical here. First, as I already alluded to, is the fact that it occurs across different time scales. Right? So from the milliseconds to years, and enculturation takes years. The second thing is designs or methods or ways of learning that optimize one layer does not necessarily optimize another layer. So methods that work to give you knowledge, to acquire knowledge, may not necessarily be the same methods that optimize social participation and enculturation. Sometimes they can actually go in diametrically opposite ways, and we have to be mindful of that. Okay? So first up, we need to have a shared understanding of what learning is and across this whole spectrum. And when we're designing for learning, we have to have a shared goal, like where are we designing for? Are you really designing enculturation, social participation, just knowledge and skills? Right? So let's come to the first big idea then. And I call it why we fail to see. So I'll just do a thought experiment. Okay? Imagine, instead of watching me, you're actually watching a very entertaining and engaging movie. Okay? Now imagine the person sitting next to you is an acclaimed director, somebody who's an expert in making movies. You watch the movies, it's very entertaining, very engaging. You come out of the theater and you see me and I ask you a question. Did you see the same movie as the director? And you say, Manu, that's a stupid question. Of course, I was sitting next to the director, I saw the same movie. But did you really see what the director saw? Chances are you would say, no. Because experts see very different things from novices. Given the same stimulus, it's right in front of you. Still, experts see very different. And decades of research actually shows this very clearly. Experts notice deep structure across situations. Novices notice superficial structure. They fail to see what is important, even when you show it's right there. What does this mean for learning? What does it mean for teaching? That the first job of teaching, if you're trying to teach somebody something new, is actually not to tell them, not to teach. It's actually to prepare the novice to see. And then you show them what you want to show them. So your expert knowledge is really critical, but from a teaching standpoint, preparing the novice to see and then showing them is absolutely critical, because novices don't see what you are seeing. Okay? How do we prepare somebody to see? Hang on, it's coming. Okay? Let's move on to the next big idea. Why we fail to understand. You see a network, and this will become clear as we go through this. Let's do another experiment. And this time I'm going to test your memory. Okay, this is going to be an experiment in memory. Let's see. I'm going to show you a few statements, and I'm going to ask you to try to remember them as best as you can. You'll only get 10 seconds to memorize these statements. You're not supposed to write down anything, okay? So no cheating in that sense. And then I'll ask you to recall. Are you ready? These statements are of this kind: who did what? So Manu gave a talk. Somebody did something. Those are the kinds of statements. Right now, you should be looking at the screens because the statements are coming up. Got 10 seconds. All right. How was that? I mean, this is a select bunch. I'm sure you did very well. Okay, so shall we try? I'll let you self-assess. But I can tell you a few things. The average is around 4 or 5. You'll get it right. I can also tell you probably remember the first couple and the last couple better than the ones in the middle. Okay? It's hard. This is hard. To remember 9 or 10 different things, that's hard. Okay? Now we're going to do this experiment one more time with a different set of names, but similar statements, but different set of names. And what if I told you that this time, everybody is going to remember everything? Would you believe it? What if we design these statements in a way that everybody remembers every statement? Let's try it. Ready? 10 seconds. All right. Okay, shall we all go through it together? I think everybody remembers. Okay. It is a trivial exercise in memory, but it illustrates an important point. The only difference between the two memory experiments was in one case, I tapped into your prior knowledge. And then became, the encoding of the new information became just effortless because I tapped into your prior knowledge. And that's the principle that you need to understand. We fail to understand because a novice's knowledge is not properly activated before they're receiving new information. So the goal of teaching, why we fail to understand, or why novices fail to understand new material, is because their knowledge is not properly activated. And if knowledge is not properly activated, the network is not properly activated, new information finds it very hard to integrate into the existing network. Okay, it's as simple as that. So if you can activate knowledge well, you can probably understand well. Again, I'm simplifying things, but it's an important principle to remember. All right, that's the second big idea. Fail to see, understand. Now, fail to transfer. Transfer is the holy grail. You know, you need to learn something in school so you can apply it later. Right? You need to learn something in one subject so they can hopefully use it in another subject. So that's what we want to aim for. So here, just to illustrate this point, another thought experiment. Let's take you back in time. This is an apprentice carpenter working with an apprentice. Now imagine if this carpenter told the apprentice, all right, before you come to the shed, you must learn a lot of mathematics because mathematics is important for carpentering. Number systems, arithmetic, measurement, geometry. Make sure you do your courses and then you come. Then I'll teach you carpentering. He says, by the way, while you're doing that, also learn a lot of physics because forces, equilibria, dynamics, all that is also very important. Once you do that, you come and I'll teach you. I say, oh, chemistry is also very important because reaction, materials, and so on and so forth. And by the way, you are there, learn some critical thinking and things like that. But that's not what happens. What happens is, come to the carpenting shed. We will learn everything, math, physics, chemistry, and everything else in the activity of carpenting. And that is a very strong model for learning. We can't do it at scale, obviously. But the important principle is everything that we know is situated in what we're doing. Okay? So knowledge, knowing, is coupled with the doing. And by doing, I don't mean just physical doing. Doing could be just thinking, could be reflecting, could be like some of you are listening, right? Could be talking to each other to solve a problem, could be designing or building. These are all different kinds of doings. You can learn the same concept or idea in different kinds of doing. You can listen to, you can encode that information by listening to it, by thinking about it, by actually solving problems, by talking to each other, by building something. These are, the same thing can be situated in different kinds of doings. And the reason why we are not able to transfer is because there is a misalignment between the kinds of doings in school and the kinds of doings later on. Now, they don't have to be perfectly aligned, but the greater the overlap between the doings of use at work or later on and the doings at school, the better the transfer. And better the chance that students don't forget everything after the final exam. Okay? So that's a fundamental problem or situatedness of learning. It is both a problem and a solution. The fact that knowledge gets situated in a practice is a problem because then it becomes less flexible. But if you can align the context well, then it can be also a solution. All right? Okay. Last big idea, and this is creativity. Okay? Again, another experiment. This time, I'm going to divide you guys into two groups. Okay? This would be group, well, it's kind of strange, the things are all over. So this is going to be group 1, and you guys are going to be group 2. Okay? I'm going to ask you to pretend, like the children on the slide, you pretend that you're young children who love to play with toys. Okay? And I'm going to come to you and say, hello kids. You can say hello, yeah. Right. Here's a toy. Here's a toy. Do you want to play with it? Very good. Take this toy, play with it. Play as you like. And I observe you. I give you the toy and I say, play as you like. And I observe how you play with it. Okay? So please play. And I come to this group. Hello. All right. They're not the most responsive bunch. Okay. And I say, same toy. hey kids, do you want to play with this toy? Not very enthusiastic. Okay. And I say, all right, you want to play with this toy? But first, you must watch me see how to play with this toy. I'll teach you first. Watch and learn. Okay? And I'll show you how to play with this toy. And you watch and learn, pay attention. Don't look at the phone. Okay, now you can play with this toy. Play as you like. Okay, and I observe who plays, how you play with it. Now, if I ask you the question, group 1 or group 2, in my observation, who would be more inventive, more creative in playing with the toy? Of course, group 1. Would anybody in group 2 object? Group 2 is very silent. So we don't know whether group 1 is going to be better because they're more engaged or because group 2 is silent. All right. What if I told you these are actually experiments that have been done? So these are not just thought experiments, these are actual experiments that have been done. And invariably, we find, on average, group 1 students are more inventive and more creative with the toy. Now imagine knowledge, concepts, ideas. They're not physical toys, but they're conceptual toys. And part of creativity comes from playing and tinkering with ideas and concepts. What it also shows is that creativity, the development of creativity, is path dependent. In other words, it matters how you learn something. How you learn even basic knowledge influences how flexible and creative you can be with that knowledge. Okay, so learning, creativity, like many things, is path dependent. Okay, so these are sort of the 4 big ideas. Right? Now, when I think about my teaching days, as a teacher, my philosophy was very simple. I thought I'll engage my students, I'll explain to them very clearly, logically, as mathematics teachers do, and hopefully they'll get it. But 2 things always happened. 1, many students failed to see what I was trying to tell them. Even when I said, if you see this, do this, this, this. Like, and teachers lament, I've taught this so many times, very straightforward, and students still do not see it. So there'll be a good proportion of students who would not be able to see it. And we've already discussed why that is the problem, right? The second thing that happened is, those students who could see and even I thought could understand it, the moment you start to probe their understanding, you'll find that they're on really shaky grounds. Okay? And I thought I was alone. But actually, this is a phenomena that is very well documented in literature. There's a famous article by Alan Schoenfeld, and the title suggests everything. You walk into this lecture and you say, wow, this is a very good lecture. But then you probe students' understandings, not very good. So what's happening? And like I said, we already know from the big ideas, the students, novices, when they're trying to learn something new, they fail to see what experts are seeing. No matter how clearly the experts, there will still be some students who will fail to see. And because their prior knowledge is not activated, they'll fail to understand it properly. And if the activities in schools are not aligned with those at work and used outside, they will fail to transfer that knowledge. And if they're not allowed to play and tinker with ideas, they will also fail to develop creativity. So what do we do? What do we do with all these failures? They say, fight fire with fire. So we fight failure with failure. Okay? And that brings me to the next part 2, which is I'm going to go into my research on productive failure. Now, let's make this again concrete. Suppose I'm trying to teach you something new, say a new math concept. You have no idea what this concept is about. I can either explain to you, teach you that concept, and then get you to solve problems. Or I can throw you in the deep end, get you to solve problems before you've learned anything, and then teach you the concept. So the first method is very straightforward. We call it direct instruction. You don't know the concept, I'm the expert, I teach you well, I explain clearly, and then get you to solve problems. Instruction followed by problem solving. Direct instruction, it's a method I learned from, I taught in this method, and it is the most dominant method even today. And it's a pretty good method. There's nothing wrong with that, okay? It's a pretty good method. It leads to fairly high levels of learning. The other method is not so straightforward. where I first engage you in problem solving, I mean, what is the point of that? Why would I engage you in problem solving which requires that you solve those problems without knowing the concepts required to solve those problems? That is pretty evil. Like, why would I want to do that? Obviously, you're not going to be able to solve the problem unless you're a genius, which is rare. So why make you fail to solve the problems? The underlying theory, or the assumption that I was challenging at the time, was this failure, if designed well, can be very productive for learning from the instruction that follows later on. So problem solving, carefully designed, followed by instruction, may initially lead to failure, but can be productive for learning later on. Okay? So how do we decide? At the time that I was thinking of this 15 years ago, when I started doing this research, the prevailing wisdom was dead against productive failure. You know, it was kind of a little bit of mad, but we are challenging assumptions here. So how do we decide? So we run experiments. We run randomized controlled experiments. We run quasi-experiments in the classrooms. Much of this work is supported locally. You know, at least my work in Singapore has been supported locally by the Ministry of Education, by the National Institute of Education, right? So we ran those experiments, and what did we find? We found that if you look at basic knowledge, you know, the kind of knowledge that comes out on tests and exams, standardized tests, both methods are very good at achieving high levels of basic knowledge, basic preparation, very quickly and quite efficiently. But where the differences start to emerge is when you start to probe students' understanding. Do they understand what they've learned? That's where the differences start to emerge in favor of productive failure. And then even greater differences start to emerge in transfer, their ability to be flexible about what they've learned, to solve even more advanced or novel problems requiring concepts that they've not learned yet. So they can adapt and transfer creatively. There, the effects are even larger. Now, these are numbers, 0.7 and 1.20. Just to put this in context against benchmarks, these differences are really strong. It is almost as if a productive failure student appears to be a year or so ahead of direct instruction students, just to put it in plain language. Okay, that's a strong effect. So, a couple of caveats here. When we're designing for productive failure, you know, I'm only talking about the initial learning. You know, when you first, so this is that's the phase that I'm designing for. When you first come to understand a new concept. I'm not talking about what happens after that, the elaboration and mastery and fluency that you develop. Because learning is path dependent, I decided to focus my research on getting the first part right, because then there are feed-forward effects to the following parts. Okay? Second, it's a deliberate design for failure. We design these problems, these activities, based on certain principles and mechanisms that we now understand based on the scientific work that we've done. So this is not just giving any hard problem. These problems there's a science behind designing these problems, which I won't go into today. And we also learned that the more students engage with these problems, the more ideas or failed solutions or suboptimal solutions they developed, the more they learned. Okay? Now you may ask, Manu, is this just your work? Are you alone in saying this? Why should I believe you? That's a fair question. And that's how science works as well. You know, when anybody comes up with, say, a novel finding, especially that goes against the prevailing wisdom of the time, prevailing scientific model of the time, you know, scientists don't go around the world and say, oh, great, let's throw everything out, and from now on we believe this one study. The logic of science is not configured that way. What people try to do is, okay, hang on. We try to replicate it. Okay, we try to replicate this work to see whether we can test this. In fact, it goes further. The logic of replication is failure itself. The logic of replication is in the fact that the scientists would try to disprove the finding that I have. So we're not pursuing truth here. We are pursuing failure, really. And the logic is simple. If repeated attempts to disprove a finding themselves fail, then maybe there is something to the finding. Okay? And that's the idea. So failure is at the heart of the scientific process as well. And that's what happened. The work was replicated, reproduced, replicated in different contexts across the world, more than 26,000 students. At last count, 166 experimental comparisons. And what we found, and this is a meta-analytical work, this is a technique to say, okay, there's so many studies out there now in the last 10, 15 years on productive failure. What is all of these studies telling us? So we use a technique called meta-analysis, which some of you might be familiar with. And we say, okay, what is the average effect of productive failure? And when productive failure gets carried out across different contexts, some do it really, really well. Some do it, somewhat fidelity to productive failure, others not quite so. So you get a variation in how it gets implemented as well, right? So anything new you try, there'll be a variation in how people would implement it. So the average effect was 0.34. I'll explain what this means. And if the productive failure intervention was carried out to high fidelity, true to the principles of productive failure, then the effect was close to 0.6. So again, just to explain this as a benchmark in the context, if you think about you're in the class of a good teacher, at the start of the year, you know something, and at the end of the year, by the time this teacher's class is over, in 1 year, you would have gained, hopefully, something. Suppose we can say this gain is 1 unit of knowledge. How much do you think productive failure students would gain? 1 unit? What would you be happy with? 2 units would be? 2 units would be good? Okay, so average effect is 2 units. But if you really do productive failure well, then it's 3 units. Okay? So we're not talking about incremental innovation here. We challenge the basic assumptions and we're talking about breakthrough innovation in how we design. It's not easy, but if you do it well, the rewards on learning, conceptual understanding, and transfer are quite significantly large. Okay. So then we started asking the question, if the main effect is really strong, what would be a small PF dose, productive failure dose? I'm sorry, in pandemic times you have to talk like that. What would be a small productive failure dose that could also be very effective? So I said, okay, let's try to do a very PF-light intervention. Okay? In this case, this is a first-year linear algebra course at ETH. It's taken by 650 students. All mechanical engineering students have to take this course. In fact, all undergraduate students probably have to take this course. It's a very critical course. It's a foundational course. It's a 1-year-long course, and it follows a very standard model of instruction. Lecture, followed by tutorials. So direct instruction. Instruction, followed by problem solving. Lecture, tutorial. And we had absolutely very few degrees of freedom to change any of that. So we had to say, okay, what is the smallest change we can make? And still see whether we can get some good effects. So we implemented productive failure. We created these problem-solving exercises and timed them surgically to be just before some of the key lectures. So altogether, for each semester, there were 5 key lectures. There were lectures every week, but 5 key concepts that we identified. And for those key concepts, we designed these problem-solving exercises. Each exercise was about 30, 35 minutes long. So the total investment, additional investment, on the part of students on a volunteer basis outside of classroom time was 7 hours for the whole year. That's the intervention here. The magic is in what happens in those 7 hours. Okay? The average passing rates, this is, the same professor teaches this course for a very long time. The average passing rates, this is a high-stakes exam. It determines whether you continue. Part of the grade determines, along with other grades, determines whether you continue in your second year program. So it's a high stakes. 55% is the average historical passing rate here. Now, if somebody told you 7-hour intervention for the whole year, voluntary basis on the part of the student, 60 to 70% of the students actually took part in it voluntarily. By how many percentage points would you be impressed? The jump in the passing rates. 5%? 10%? So 7-hour intervention for the whole year, and you want 10%. It's a greedy lot. Would any of you buy it if I told you like 7 hours can give you 10%? That's a lot. Historically, it stayed at 55. And with 7 hours for the whole year, you want 10%. 7%. No, wait. I'll give you 20%. I was just setting you up. Percent. We increased over 2 years, the iterations. These are just some statistical charts. 2 years, the grades went up. The effect sizes, as you can see, is around the same, 0.38 in the first year and 0.59 in the second year. So even a very small intervention like that, 7 hours for the whole year, can create very powerful, provided you follow the science, you do it well, and you do it the right time when the learner is ready. Okay, so changing, revolutionizing learning and pedagogy is does not necessarily have to be this magic full change. No. If you follow the scientific basis, the science of learning, you can create very powerful effects based on the latest research. Okay, that's the point. So why does productive failure work? Again, there are the complex set of mechanisms. So I simplify into 4 A's, straight A's. Okay? First is activation. By now, you already know what that means. When you engage students in these failed problem-solving efforts, you're activating their knowledge. They understand, they know themselves what it is that they know that is relevant to learning this new thing. They also know what doesn't work. Right? So that is very good activation of the cognitive system, which creates awareness. I know that I was not able to solve this problem. I tried several things, but they did not work. There is something that the teacher knows that I do not know which would work. So there's an awareness of a gap. And that is a very good state to be in. And if you have the right mindset or the motivation behind it, it creates a very strong affect. We measured interest in finding out the correct way of doing the canonical idea spikes. The orientation towards the lecture changes. That is, students now really want to understand, okay, why is your method better than what I tried? It is not just sitting through a lecture, I really want to understand what happened. Now imagine your knowledge has been activated, prior knowledge has been activated, you've tried several things, you're aware that there's a gap, and you're in a cognitive, affective state that is primed for you to learn. At that time, if a teacher comes in and explains to you and assembles this knowledge together, that makes for a powerful learning. And that's what productive failure, that's why it works. Okay, very simply put. All right, so that's assembly. So I'll end this part on productive failure by talking about this distinction between learning and performance, just to put everything into a context. We're used to conflating these things, but performance is not the same. Just because a computer is performing very solid calculations very quickly doesn't mean it's necessarily learning anything, right? Just because students are able to solve problems on a test does not mean they really understand that material. So learning and performance are 2 different constructs. And if you do that 2 by 2, just as an analytical category, it's a spectrum, but let's say you can have high performance or low performance, and you can have high learning and low learning. So when high performance and high learning coincide, we can call it productive success. This is what happens with experts, especially when they're in the zone, when they're in the flow. They're performing very well and they're learning a lot and they're producing a lot. That's productive success. That's rare to achieve, but something to aspire to. Sometimes performance is low initially. You're struggling, you're tinkering, you're trying to find the solution, but it's not working. But learning is high, and that's productive failure. Sometimes there's no performance or little performance and no learning. This is pure discovery learning. Throwing you into the deep end and saying, go figure. That doesn't work very well. Okay, that's unproductive failure. But then there is this little beast that we all have to be very careful about, which is high performance but low learning. It's an illusion of learning in high performance, and that is unproductive success. And that is something a lot of schooling and education suffers from. And we are trying to figure out alternative pathways to design for high learning or deep learning, basically. Okay, and productive failure is one way of doing it. It's not the only way, but it's one with breakthrough effects. Right, so that's end of part 2. Now we're ready to move a little bit into the future. Okay, so I want to orient you towards how I think about the future. When I started work on productive failure, the kind of challenge I was trying to take on was not something that you could solve in 1, 2, or even 5 years. We were challenging basic assumptions, and it was a project worth 15, 20 years. And 15 years later, we are here, and I can share this work with you, reproduced worldwide, replicated nicely, and so on and so forth. Very strong effects. And hopefully this will make its way to more classrooms and change education systems and so on and so forth. So what do we do now for the next 20 years? What kind of challenges do we take on? I don't want to take on the challenges that can be solved in the next 2, 5 years. I'm thinking 10, 15, 20 years. What kind of challenges do we take? And that's what brought me to ETH, actually. There it was told, Manu, we'll give you time, we'll give you funding, and we'll give you trust. Go crazy. So what are these big challenges? And that's what brought me to ETH. It needed the right setup, and it needed the right strategy. So we set up this Future Learning Initiative that Patricia also talked about in the introduction. And what this was a recognition, this was an ETH-wide strategy on the learning sciences, a commitment to the learning sciences. A lot of funding went into this. And it was a recognition that learning sciences is not something that learning scientists alone do. We have to change that model. Learning is a complex phenomena, and therefore research on learning has to, utilize, ETH-wide, interdepartmental, interdisciplinary expertise. So not one person on one expertise can solve this. So we want to focus on fundamental research and learning, aligned with the university's goals of research and knowledge creation, obviously. We want to focus on translating research into practice, and we want to focus on long-term capacity building. So now we're in the business of producing the next generation of learning scientists that have very strong STEM backgrounds, but they're doing their PhDs in learning. In 3 to 5 years, we will graduate 15 to 20 doctoral students, and every 3 to 5 years after that, we will do the same. And before you know it, we have suddenly very highly talented, strong STEM foundation learning scientists in the system that can do amazing stuff. This is the team of people that I work with. There are professors in there, more than 20 professors from different departments, from engineers to science and biologists, physicists, mathematicians, architects, and there are 15 to 20 doctoral scientists, postdoctoral students as well, all exploring different aspects of learning, both fundamental and applied, okay, towards this initiative. And there's a whole lot of work that's going on, and I can't do everything, but I'll highlight 3, I think, relevant things here today. Okay, so 3 things. First, as you might have guessed, artificial intelligence. Okay, now, you'd be surprised maybe that the Journal of Artificial Intelligence in Education has been around for 40, 50 years. So there's a long tradition in education and artificial intelligence. But recent advances in machine learning have really produced a sea change. And it's a significant shift in the capabilities. But if you look at the capabilities of AI, it does really well around very well-defined, rule-based, narrowly defined problems. So pattern recognition, perceptual systems, rule-based gaming, even debates and argumentation where the structure is very well-defined. Okay, so it can do this very well, automated marking. So we call it sort of narrow AI, and it's getting better and better, and it will continue. But human intelligence is beyond that. It is that, but it's also more that. The second part of human intelligence is effortless. The amount of energy that goes into doing these things is vast in artificial intelligence systems, but human systems actually take a very small amount of energy. So the underlying architecture is something very different, possibly. So what we are thinking about is, okay, so how do we optimize AI based on what we know about human learning? So we're taking the latest research, say productive failure mechanisms, to build better AI systems. And then with these AI systems, feed back into learning systems to personalize learning even better. So what you will see is one fundamental advance in the next 15 to 20 years on a very basic question. How does cognition emerge from brain behavior? How does that happen? And I think AI would be quite critical in that. More applied, you will see learning sciences powered edtech supported by AI. We're now creating the next generation of such tools using productive failure principles. And I tell you, even though it's very early stages, the investor interest is amazing because they see the effects, the technological capabilities are there, and it can do really breakthrough innovation. Okay? I think in the next 10 to 15 years, maybe even sooner, we will have the next $1 trillion edtech company. We will definitely have it. A second thing, a second implication for schooling and higher education is based on an understanding of the knowledge that experts have. And here we need to understand this distinction a little bit better. And this is, if you study expert knowledge, there's a lot of knowledge that is explicit. The constructs, the symbols, the grammar, the language of the domain. You can talk about it, you can write books on it, you can give lectures. Experts have access to this so they can tell you this. This is explicit knowledge. Okay? Every domain has it. But there's a lot of knowledge that is tacit. Even experts themselves cannot access this knowledge. It's situational. It's so deeply internalized, perhaps. Maybe it's even intuitive. You can't capture this. You can't access. You can just do it. So what does this mean for higher education or schooling and higher education? With advances in AI, everything, if it can be made explicit, it can be codified. And if it can be codified, it can be automated. This means that if the emphasis in our schooling and education remains on explicit knowledge only or mainly, we will be obsolete. But if we recognize that true expertise is a coupling between the explicit and the tacit, and we reorganize the education to focus on this coupling, not losing the explicit, by the way, okay? On this coupling between the explicit and the tacit, then we can leverage AI for very strong, robust purposes, okay? But the danger is there, and I think we need to think, because we do focus a lot on the explicit knowledge. But hopefully, slowly, that is changing. The second big challenge that we're taking on, and this has been going on for a while, is what is called embodiment. And I'll, again, illustrate it with a simple. I'm going to show you a picture, then I'm going to tell you what is probably happening in your mind. Okay? Maybe some of you are craving for it. I see a bottle of wine on the table. All right. Now, what is happening when you see this picture is your mind is reconstructing this image, this perceptual. But what is additionally happening is that your motor circuits are also getting activated, as though you're reaching out and grasping the bottle. Although no one is overtly doing this motion. What this means, literally, is that when we encode information, we don't encode it in some kind of abstract amodal way. It is a multimodal encoding, including motion. The mind and the body are connected. Cognition and motor movement are connected, they're coupled. In the Western canon, we are used to thinking of the mind as a disembodied mind, the Descartesian view of I think, therefore I am. It's mind and body are separate. In the Eastern canon, we have had a sense, philosophically and spiritually, that mind and body are connected. In a scientific sense, we know very little. Biology is undergoing change, medicine is undergoing change, robotics are undergoing change, and learning science is also undergoing change along this. So embodiment is a big theme. Okay? What this means is, one of the fundamental questions, can action or movement influence cognition? Now, the other way is very simple. Cognition influencing action is very simple. I want to raise my hand. I raise my hand. I want to walk there, and I walk there. So cognition influencing action is straightforward. We're all used to it. But can my raising the hand and walking there actually influence cognition? We know already from physiological research, if you're tired, the hike that you go on will appear steeper than it is. If you're at a cocktail party, if you're holding a warm glass of warm drink, which is unlikely, but if you're holding a warm drink, the person you're talking to is going to appear warmer, a warmer personality. If I ask you now to go to your edge of your seats and bend forward to look at me, your attention capacity increases. So we know bodily states and postures and gestures can actually make a difference to cognition, to attentional states. If that is the case, if we can understand the science behind it, that leads to a very interesting idea. And that is, can we then make you move to learn something? Right now, if I want to teach you something, I use your visual perceptual system. I show you, so I tell you, you can hear, you can see things, you can hear things, you can even do some things. But imagine if I could say, before we learn something, let's move in certain ways. And imagine if that movement actually helps you encode information later on. So there are studies that are starting to come out where if you engaged in this motion, just like a regular stretch, an exercise, and if after this motion, I gave you a lesson or an instruction on, say, the concept of variation, standard deviation variation in a population. Even though I did not tell you that this is connected to that, I just told you this is just for let's just have a little bit of fun. You will encode information better. It's remarkable. I don't even have to tell you that the movement is influencing. It just does. If I suppose start moving, get you to stretch like this. Okay, I look stupid right now, but that's okay. If I just stretch like this, and then later teach you triangle geometry, you're more likely to develop insights and intuitions that the side opposite the smaller angle would be smaller. Right? So as you increase the angle, the side increases. I did not tell you, but these are experiments that are going on. Okay? And so that's what this is showing. This is emerging work. It's been around for 5 to 10 years, but there's tremendous potential. Can I make you move in ways that help you learn things that are otherwise quite abstract? Okay? But embodied cognition or embodiment is a very broad framework that I think will become really important later as a research framework. Because what this is bringing together is not just learning, but health and aging. We're used to thinking learning and health and aging as two separate things. Because of the coupling of the mind and the body, there is now convergence. You cannot think of learning independently of health and aging, of the body's physiological state, and the ways of moving can help you do that. Neurorehabilitation is making significant advances here. Right? Computer science is going to be, neuroscience is going to come in, robotics are going to come in, and of course the STEM domains. So anybody who's looking at research in the next 15, 20 years will have to think about all of these convergences, and embodiment is one framework that can really position yourself in a very coherent way to align for the next 10, 20 years. The final idea, the last bit that we're focusing on among the projects that we're doing is what I call learnability. Historically, we focused a lot on learning. What do students need to learn? They need to learn science, mathematics, engineering, arts, humanities. We focused comparatively little on learnability. Can they learn something? Do they have the ability to learn something new? And there are some historical forces or contexts that we need to understand. First is the demand forecast model. We're very used to, in the past, and even now, to forecast demand. We need so many engineers, so many doctors, so many scientists, so many teachers, so many lawyers, and then we design for it. But what is happening slowly but surely, maybe fast as well, is that we're finding it difficult to keep on doing that because the pace of change is very fast. And there will come a point in time where the pace of change is so fast, so dynamic, that our ability to adapt to it would not be possible. So what do we do then? How do we prepare students for that era? That is upon us. Second, curriculum content has seen steady increase over the years. Students today are learning probably more content than what you and I did. And you and I learned more content than what the previous generation did. And there's nothing wrong with that. I'm not suggesting anything wrong, but it's unsustainable because the sciences are going to keep on producing content. Do we keep packing everything in? Some systems have tried to cut content, and that's very good actually. Okay. But this is a worldwide problem. What do? Students are so packed, the curriculum is so packed, with content that there's no chance to do anything else. Are we always forever going to be taking bets that this is important and that is important and that is important too? What is a minimal set? It's not sustainable. Third, the future of work itself is changing. I'm in my 4th job. Hopefully this is my only job. This is my last job. But I'm in my 4th job, and we are preparing students for their first job. What will happen after that will depend on the kinds of skill sets and dispositions, learnability. So we need to focus on learnability a lot more than what we are currently doing. I'm not saying we're not doing anything, but we need to focus on. But let's define this first. What does learnability mean? Because it can mean many things. I'm talking about a specific kind of learnability. It is to learn something new or novel, something that is outside your domain, your current expertise. It cannot be something within it, or maybe something that's very advanced. Okay? So it has to be something new, novel, outside your comfort zone. It has to be something that is hard, not learning easy things. It has to be something that's hard, difficult, complex. It has to be something that you have to do it in a timely manner. There is no time for you to go to school, learn this, and come back to work. It has to be done more efficiently, timely, fast. That is the essence. And you have to be incredibly resourceful. So you can use, with the democratization of knowledge and internet, and access to resources is plentiful. Access to expertise, peers, teamwork, collaboration. These are all resources, and we need to develop. You need to be very resourceful. So can you think of something in your real lives? If I were to ask you the question, when was the last time you learned something that was new, outside your comfort zone, something that was hard, something that had to be done quickly, and you had to be incredibly resourceful about it? Because that's the kind of skill sets, that's the kind of learnability that is needed. And we need to prepare students for that. So then comes the question, back to the learning sciences. I think it's fair to conjecture that both learning and learnability are path dependent. In other words, how you learn something influences how well you understand it and how good you are at learnability, how well you can learn new things as well. But what is not clear is whether the paths to learning and learnability are the same paths. So are methods that optimize deep learning, are they the same methods that also optimize learnability? Or are they opposing each other, or is it a mixed bag? We don't know the answers to these questions fully. We're only beginning to research that. So this leads to another 2x2, and the final 2x2, okay? Sorry. And you have learning at the x-axis, just analytical categories, dichotomies, deep learning or high learning versus low learning. If you are a mathematician, you have high domain knowledge in mathematics, but maybe not so high knowledge in philosophy. I don't know, So these are relative categories, okay? And then you have learnability, that you're able to learn something in the ways that I defined it. New, hard, fast, and resourceful, okay? I mean it in that very specific sense. So if you're somebody who has high level of learning, high level of knowledge in a domain, but low on learnability, you're more likely to be a routine expert. And by the word routine, I don't mean any value judgment. We need people who are very good at the things that they do. Airline pilot, not to be too adventurous. I want my surgeon to know what he or she is doing and do it really well, even without looking perhaps. Right? So we need routine experts. This is by no way a value judgment, but it is a characterization of what this category is. But there are some experts who also have high learnability. You know, the mathematician who can learn physics or philosophy or neuroscience or something like that. They don't have to become physicists or neuroscientists and so on, but they learn enough quickly so that they can talk to people and have a shared understanding, shared representation, shared language, which is so important if you want to do interdisciplinary work, right? And these are adaptive experts. More innovation, more innovative in their orientation and production and performance. Then there are people who are not quite, well, let's just call them jack of all trades, master of none. People who know a lot of things, and they have high learnability. They love to, and they can learn new things very quickly to a sufficient depth that they can talk to a lot of people. And these are the generalists. Okay? Now, like I said, we need, in an ecosystem, we need all of them. We need different categories. We need all of them because everyone serves a very important function. But the one category that we missed is somebody who has low level of knowledge or expertise and finds it very hard to move outside of that. And that is underdetermined potential. So we should obviously minimize that. So that's the outcome, right? That's the outcome. So people and their characteristics. We can also think of it from a process standpoint. What kinds of learning paths lead you into the adherence? So if let's cycle back to productive failure and direct instruction. We talked about these two learning paths, right? So what do we learn about productive failure versus direct instruction? The productive failure develops deeper conceptual understanding. So relative to direct instruction, productive failure is more on the routine expert versus a direct instruction is on the lower end, okay, relatively speaking. But we also learned that productive failure engages students in precisely the kinds of learnability I was talking about. Students engage in solving something new, learning something new, something that is hard, they don't even have the knowledge for it, something they have to do quickly, 35, 40 minutes, and they have to be resourceful, they have to learn together. So by that theory, one would predict that their transfer capabilities should be quite high. And what do the results suggest that I shared? Transfer was indeed high. So probably productive failure is a learning path that develops adaptive experts. Other learning paths may develop other kinds of experts. All right? And so this becomes both an outcome analysis tool, but also a process analysis tool as to how we think about learning. The research, I'm afraid, is only just starting. It's trying to make sense of this construct, but this will become really important. Okay? So that was my last bit. In ending, I would say, given what we know now, decades of research in cognition and learning, and I tell my students, we are no longer allowed, and this would be controversial, we are no longer allowed an opinion on teaching and learning. 30 years ago, forgive. This is so controversial, what's going on? 20, 30 years ago, we could forgive ourselves for having an opinion on learning. I believe where I this. Right now, we stand on much firmer science to make sound, evidence-based arguments and judgments and decisions. Opinions are not enough. With that, I thank you. Discussing them with you.
Thank you, Professor Manu. I'm inspired. I'm going back to chuck all my instruction manuals away. Okay. We come to the interesting part of the session. We like to, if you got, I believe a lot of you have some burning questions, whether it's on site or, at home over the screen. So before we begin, I'd like to state some house rules. For the on-site attendees who like to pose questions, there are certain instructions for you, which is something that please comply with. Number one, put on your mask when we pass the mic to you. Okay, you have to identify yourself whether you're an NUSS member, you're from NUS, or you're from the public. And of course, before we pass the mic to you, you're going to put up your hand. And yeah, right? So each speaker is entitled to maximum 1 minute of the questions. Thereafter, a bell will ring, and you're supposed to stop. Okay. So as for the online attendees via Zoom, please click on the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen to post your questions. Okay, with that, may we invite Dr. Chen back on stage to moderate the Q&A session. Thank you.
Okay, let's have our first question, but first I would like to thank Professor Kapur for that really insightful and thought-provoking talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
Please go ahead.
Test. Okay. Professor Kapur, thank you for that very, very interesting talk. I was really captivated at that 2x2 matrix of learning and performance. And I'm very interested in I totally follow the dangers of low learning and high performance, so you get unproductive successes. To help reinforce that, I mean, I understand it conceptually, I can even relate to it, but could you give us a couple of to help reinforce what examples of unproductive successes?
Well, one is very simple. What happens, we know from research on retention, students, the decay in retention is very strong. So you can take an exam, you can score very well, and within 2, 3, 4 weeks, you've lost a lot of it. Right? So what does it mean? Have you learned anything if you can't even retain it? We're not even talking about understanding or transfer. So that is at a very basic level, unproductive success.
We have another question from the gentleman at the back.
Yeah, hello, Prof. Very, very exciting to hear what you have said. My name is Srini. I'm an NUSS member, former alumni of NUS. I want to see if I can combine 3 questions in the 1 minute that you gave me. Let me read out a quick one. I mean, what is your take on, is it best to kind of look at productive failure in the early stages of somebody's learning, or more at a uni level where I think a better learning environment exists, which means that the students themselves are better prepared for what they're looking for? How much of a cultural influence will have an impact on PF, given that our obsession with grades in Singapore limits our ability to even think out of the box sometimes? And the third one, moving on, when you talked about creativity, can we at some point look at us as a nation that is perceived to have some scale at the creativity level than being routinely characterized as a highly efficient country and clean and neat, but very little on what we can do out of the box? Your take on that?
Thank you. So for the last question, the answer is yes. I hope we get there. We do perform very well on the international tests and assessments, including problem-solving tests, right? Not just necessarily basic fluency. So that's a good sign, but yes, you're right. I hope by slowly but surely changing the system, the way we teach, the way we design these experiences, that we will develop these creativity mindsets and creativity faculties and dispositions. We know exactly how to do them. We know ways that develop. Now it's a question of whether we can implement that in the curriculum. And we've done some of that. Okay, so that's the third question. The second thing about culture is very important. The unit of change is actually not technically the teaching method. The unit of change is culture. Every learning and human activity is a cultural activity. So you're absolutely right. But the bulk of the work actually comes from Singapore. We've been able to do this work, yes, in controlled environments as well, but also in real classrooms, real teachers. Engaging with them and literally being in the classrooms with these teachers to carry. So this is time-consuming work, but it can be done. And that's why I'm saying this is a tractable solution, and we change. And we talk with teachers and we discuss with teachers what are these cultural values, what are these expectations and norms that you want to set in your classrooms, that effort is important, ideas are important, exploration is important, especially in the first part of productive failure. And it's doable, and it happens. So slowly cultural change can happen. The first question also hits on a very important point, and that is the productive failure system is designed for initial learning, when your initial expertise in the domain is low. So it's relative to the complexity of the material that you need to learn and your own expertise. So you're right that by the time students enter university, they have high domain knowledge in a number of disciplines. But relative to what they need to learn, they may still be novices. And to the extent that that gap is a big one, a reasonable one, productive failure should still work very well. Like I showed you the example with the large class at ETH. It works wonderfully. But yes, maybe if you're advanced graduate students, or third or fourth year students, where the knowledge gap starts to reduce a little bit, and then they can a lot of these things on their own as well, or in close collaboration with their professors and other people, then yes, there's no need for productive failure. So if you are a mathematician talking to a bunch of mathematicians, there's no need to do productive failure, just lecture. It's simple, because everybody has the domain knowledge and you're building off of that. But if you're teaching novices, then that's where the real utility of productive failure resides.
So I know there are more questions from the floor, but if you don't mind, let's mix it up a bit so that we also give a chance to our participants online. So actually, building off what you have been describing, people are very excited to learn more about how you structure productive failure within the curriculum. Can you kind of give us a few concrete examples of how you've done this, how you've worked with teachers to do this?
Wow, okay. So there are so many layers to this. First up is to have a shared conversation about goals. What are the goals of, what do you want to achieve in the classroom? So if teachers are very practical lot, some of them says the performance, the assessments are so important, I cannot shortchange the students. Okay, I feel a moral responsibility to make sure students do well on assessments. And my goal is that they do well on these assessments. I say, okay, is there any other goal? So yeah, I want deep understanding as well. I want students to understand the material as well. And then I want them to collaborate with each other, to learn how to collaborate and so on. So to the extent we can have a conversation around these shared goals and it matches with what the productive failure is trying to achieve, we say, okay, game on. Because with productive failure, you will not shortchange your basic knowledge and performance, but we will deliver on conceptual understanding and transfer. Okay? And with that kind of a conversation, we try. Most of the times when we first try it out in the classroom, teachers are quite pleasantly surprised at what students are actually able to do. And once they see student production and the ideas that students produced, there's nothing more convincing to them. They don't even need to see the effects later on because it's evident in what students actually produce. And that creates a positive loop. So one teacher is doing it, then maybe a department is doing it, and several schools are doing it. And we built up productive failure not from any top-down initiative in Singapore. I started with one classroom in one school back in 2007. And the reason I got into this classroom also because the head of department was my math tutor. So these things you don't write about in the papers, but it's true. That's how I got in. But one pocket of innovation creates few, and then over time, people start to take notice. Okay, there is something going on here that is systematically producing effects, and the ministry was very supportive. They funded a lot of this work. Then the work went into the second level where we started training teachers, so that we train teachers on productive failure principles so they can design for productive failure, which did not turn out to be a spectacular success. So we went back to the drawing board, again with ministry support, and we said, okay, why don't we create the curriculum? So the stats curriculum that you talked about that was scaled in the pre-university curriculum, we created that curriculum with the teachers and then trained them to implement that. So we went through a very long process by the time it went up to a national scaling strategy.
Wonderful, thank you. And back to the floor. the gentleman in the front here.
Thank you. My name is Prasad, NUSS member. Can you hear me clearly? Your little exercise on prior knowledge and prior raised a couple of thoughts in my head. So does the methodology that you are developing is equally applicable to young children whose level of prior knowledge might not be so high? And then young adults as they get older, university students, obviously it does for ETH. And then for adults, working people who need to be retrained and who need to be reskilled, and that's a very big thing now. And we also talk about unlearning. So how do we get prior fixed ideas out of your system, out of your cognitive domain, so that you can learn new things? So that's one. And my second question is about, do assessment systems have to change as well?
So the answer to the second question is yes. It's somewhat easier to answer questions backwards. Yes, so assessment systems have to change. One of the projects, or one of the thrusts in my research that we're doing at ETH Hub, I didn't talk about, is actually designing assessment systems that capture the effects, the ecologically valid assessments of learning, of learnability and learning together. And I think that's key, so we need to change. We're doing that research, so the answer to that question is yes. For the first part, it's going back to young children. What the assumption in the theory is that there's a differential between the current knowledge state and the state you want to get to. And as long as this differential is high, productive failure should. It's worth a try. And it's not something that we've just tried at ETH or in a few schools here. Like I said, it's been replicated in 166 experimental comparisons across the world in different domains, in different age groups and so on. So the effects are really robust. In the case of adult learners, there is actually I don't have evidence, so I would not venture out other than a theoretical speculation. But I already warned everybody against an opinion or a speculation earlier. So I shall not go there. We don't have evidence right now.
Yes.
I'm just curious, how far has the curriculum of the educators in Singapore been? How long ago has it been amended for them to take this approach, this PF approach? And assuming that it was probably not too long ago, even if it's 10 years ago, it's probably not that long ago. How difficult is it going to be to get the educators who have been taught to educate in a different way, to unlearn all the methodology and to adopt this productive failure approach?
So from a scientific standpoint, we only just uncovered the average effects, right? So we've been doing this work in the different classrooms and school systems and education systems, but really now it's coming to take a very strong picture, a very robust picture of these effects. It takes 15, 20 years for things to go back into the design of how, say, teacher education is done, how teacher training is done. And I think those would be the next steps potentially, where these kinds of things can flow back into the system, how we train educators. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Xian Hui, a NUSS member. I think it's a very interesting lecture that you gave just now. My question really is, can you extrapolate that to groups? Has there been any research being done adopting the same methodology for group problem solving versus the individual?
Great question. We've done this work both in groups and individual settings. That was a technical thing that, you have this overall effect and you break it down with different kinds of experimental manipulations. And we found that it works in both cases. And surprisingly, there was no gain, or there was no better configuration, group or individual. And one of the reasons I think that's important, why that is the case, is the signal. The failure signal is so strong that it doesn't matter whether you're alone solving a problem or you're in a group, because the failure signal, the information is very salient, and that helps you learn very fast.
All right. At this point, let me take one more question from online. This question is about the role of parenting. So we've heard about teachers and students, but how can parents teach well? How can they leverage some of these productive failure ideas you've talked about in raising their children?
Right. So, well, just structure a bit less. Allow kids to play a little bit more. What does it show? Like, more knowledge is not necessarily better. How you get that knowledge is more important, because the path. I think that's the message for parents. Learning, creativity, critical thinking, all these are path dependent. So be careful what you're doing initially. It's not that, I want to get everything in so that student can later be creative and can do it. No. How you learn even basic stuff influences how creative and how those dispositions. And that effect is very strong, very clear from research. So just be very careful, would be my message.
We need to be careful not to unteach the productive failure practices that they're doing in school. All right, back to the floor. Are there any questions?
Hi.
Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Kapur, for the illuminating lecture. My name is Han Kiet, and I am a NUS staff. So I will try to squeeze in 2 questions in 1 minute. First question is about the mechanics of how you do productive failure. Is it simply removing the instruction or withholding the instruction till later, or is there some other trade secrets that you're not telling us yet? In other words, can we just turn any problem into a problem solving to be done in this manner? Second question is that if we give them the problem and we bring in the instruction later, and what if we follow that up with a variation of the first problem? Will we also turn productive failure into productive success? Thank you.
Great. Both questions are very nice. So I did not talk about, not because I want to be secretive, my work is out there. It's, research is in the public domain. You can read the papers. I think I didn't want to go into the technical details. So all I will say at this point in time, that there are certain sets of principles, mechanisms by which these tasks are designed. We want to have an affective draw. We want to have them intuitive activation. They're designed to have certain kinds of contrasts and invariant structure. Again, I'm going into the technical detail. But there are certain principles. It's not just throwing any hard problem or any problem at the student. Okay, so, and if you're interested, I'm happy to send you some of those papers if you like. So there are design principles behind it. The second question about giving them a variation of the problem later on, yes, that is something that we design in our conceptual understanding assessments and transfer assessments. So one of the problems for transfer, for a topic on when they were learning standard deviation, I don't know how many people know standard deviation, but this lot should know, right? Was a question on normalization. So it's a much harder problem. It's 2 years ahead in the academic curriculum, and we see how flexible is this knowledge that they've learned, that they can solve a problem on normalization or standardization. So those are precisely the kinds of ways in which we probe. What is it that you know? How flexible, how adaptive, how deep is this? Thank you.
There's an interesting question coming online about if productive failure has any impact on the mental health of students.
Excellent question, and I think this serves to clarify that when the phenomena is called productive failure, I don't go around in the classroom saying you failed at solving the problem and you failed at solving. No, in the classroom, the message, the cultural norm is, and the expectation is that we're interested in your effort, we're interested in your ideas, we expect that you do not know how to solve this problem. Don't worry about that. Generate ideas, and that is this message. That's the norm. And students do that. Yes, the failure is the term is defined technically from the problem-solving literature. You have not reached the goal state, and therefore the problem-solving is incomplete. That's a technical term, but in the classroom, we say, well, good job, good effort. Now you're prepared to learn from instruction. Okay? The second message is this. We know that assessments are hard. The high-stakes assessments are important. And part of the messaging and work with the teachers is by designing deliberately for failure initially and early on and engaging in that, actually reduces the likelihood of failure when it really counts, because you're learning better. And that's a very powerful argument to make in the classrooms.
I love that. The nuances of the framing in setting these up seems very important. Yes, a question from the gentleman here.
Lim Sun Hock, NUSS member and adjunct prof with NUS. Prof, based on your findings and now, of course, the availability of technologies such as AI, can we safely assume that mass customization, sorry, can you hear me? Mass customization of learning be a reality and be pursued, as a main highway for the future of learning?
That is indeed one of the, we don't call it mass customization because I don't know what that technically means. We call it just simply personalized learning. Yes. So yes, we would be able to design systems first that are based on the learning sciences. A lot of ed tech that's out there is not actually based on learning sciences. It's based on how people think learning should be, right? But we're now designing those systems. And like I said, our research will actually feed into the design of AI algorithms as well to make them better, maybe even more human, so that they can be used more powerfully to design these adaptive learning mechanisms. So I would say in the next 10 years, we should be able to have some of these next generation solutions coming out. Currently, we don't quite have at that level. So the question is,
my point today, see the pedagogical delivery model. It is still one teacher, one classroom, or in university, one lecturer, lecturing to a group of students. That hasn't changed for donkey years, right? And from your learnability and learn matrix, different people have different capabilities and capacity. So to me, the appeal of mass customization of learning, or in your context, personalized learning, is such a strong appeal, And why aren't we pursuing the big way?
Sorry, the reason why we have, because it's an incredibly hard problem to solve. I think some of the parts that I was trying to communicate, even with the advances of AI, what AI is currently doing really well are very narrowly well-defined problems. Human intelligence and adapting to human behavior is incredibly complex, which would be comforting to a lot of people, because it's a long way still before technology can seek to understand us at that level. But we grow slowly, right? And I think that's the process. It's just incredibly hard. Despite what you hear in the popular press, it is an incredibly hard problem to solve. It will require both advances in learning as well as advances in computer science. And we have projects that we are trying to start doing that. Okay, so give us a few more years and we'll have better solutions by that time.
There's a similar question online. You might already have answered it, but I shall pitch it for you. How do you replicate productive failure on a purely virtual learning platform as online learning is becoming more and more prevalent today?
Well, we are developing those systems. So I will tell you how it looks like. We have prototypes already. Because the basic learning, the cognitive architecture, the learning architecture is there. It's very robust. We know if you design learning in that way, it creates very strong effects, breakthrough effects in learning. Now we're implementing that in technology. We lose some of the affordances of face-to-face, but we gain others in terms of adaptability and personalization. So I would say, like I said in my talk, in the next 5-10 years, we will have the next generation of learning sciences powered ed tech. That is definitely one of the goals.
We need to give you more money and more manpower so that can be brought forward earlier. The lady in the front, and then the gentleman in the back. Sorry.
You mentioned that learning, my name is Kwan Tai from NUSS. You mentioned that learning is path dependent. Is it just two paths? The PF paths? Is it just two? Because I hear you say it's PF or DI.
Great. So, but But you understand what path dependence is, right? So I don't have to go into that. No, they're not just two paths. As scientists, we try to look at the extremes. Because if you find, when you're doing experimental manipulation, you try to create contrasts and extreme contrasts at times to capture an effect. And if there is an effect, then you try to narrow it down. So the part of the research that I did not talk about was the work in the middle. There's a lot of work in unpacking little bits of mechanisms, that push you into the spectrum in the middle. That I did not talk about. That's the scientific work you have to do to understand how it works, why it works. If you change this, would it make a difference? If we create a slightly different design, would it? Those are the kinds of experimental work that we do, but I have not talked about it. So there's certainly no one path, but just as an analytical category, a contrast, it is good to talk about this extreme contrast just to communicate the research a little bit better.
Sorry, I skipped over the gentleman at the back.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Prof Kapur, for a very intriguing framework. My quick question is, I recall when you mentioned you have 7 failures intervention.
7 hours of.
Hours. Is what pushed them to say where is the tipping point where beyond which the students will become demotivated and they will never gain the productivity that is.
Sorry, I didn't get it. Do you mean where is the tipping point where it stops having marginal gains? Yeah, so I think this was built into the system because the entire participation was voluntary. And although we designed 10 these strategic exercise sessions lasting 35 minutes or so each, not everybody participated in all 10. So you can actually see a drop off. Again, that's and one of the results that I did not share was we found a very strong correlation between as people participate more, the stronger is their effect on learning. So those kinds of results are also indicative of the kind of question that you're asking. So there is some kind of a marginal gain at which it stops.
There are exciting questions coming in online. Hi, Prof. What are your views of 10,000 hours of practice to achieve mastery? Is that related to productive failure?
I'm not really sure I've seen the word, the 10,000 hours much in any scientific paper. I think it was popularized in the popular science in some commercial press book, I think, right? So, but I think it's not the 10,000 hours per se. It's more, yes, to become an expert, you really need a lot of training, a lot of expertise, a lot of deliberate practice to become fluent and really master that domain. So there's no denying that expertise requires concentrated, long-term investment of time, right? So, and productive failure is suggesting that if you design the initial learning in that trajectory well, then you'll get 2 things that are going on in that expertise that would be good. A, the feed-forward effects of better learning can potentially make the process more efficient. And B, you'll become more adaptive, more flexible with what you're learning. So, and that may make the difference between whether you're a routine expert or an adaptive expert or somewhere in between. So the nature of expertise and your ability to respond to situations could potentially change. But yes, expertise requires long-term investment and time.
Actually, related to that is another question. How can productive failure be used as a mechanism of sorts to improve the acquisition of tacit knowledge rather than just explicit knowledge?
So when we engage students in problem solving, we're giving them these challenging tasks. They're challenging by definition because they're novel and the knowledge that they currently have is insufficient to solve that problem. We are already engaging them in either collaborative problem solving or design situations where they have to invent solutions. These are precisely the kinds of activities where you can develop tacit knowledge. And when the teacher comes and facilitates or builds on this and assembles it all together, those are precisely also the kinds of opportunities where the student is primed to pick up things even if they're not explicitly stated. So in many ways, I think that's what productive failure does, is to achieve this tight coupling between both explicit and tacit in the way that we design that sequence where students engage in problem solving and then the teacher or an expert assembles it together for them.
Wonderful, thank you. And there's a question from the front.
Hi, I'm Teck Wee, NUSS member. I have two questions. The first question is that in your personal journey to date, when do you see societies at large being able to embrace or celebrate failures? That's one. Part two of the first question is that which society do you see, or which country do you see that is actually very close to that level? Okay. Question two. You know, everybody studies for employment, most of them on the practical sense. So would you see that in a stage within our lifespan, any companies that will actually remunerate or reward professionals who are expert in failing? Thank you.
Okay, so experts at failing. So again, I'm going to go back, answer the questions in the reverse order. So the idea is not so much that you become an expert in failing. The idea is that you become an expert in exploring the boundaries of your knowledge and what you can do with it. And then failure is simply a byproduct. So companies should start to reward people who are at this boundary, who invent new ideas, who try new ideas, not to give them a failure reward, but to say, keep inventing, keep creating, keep working at this edge. Because if you don't explore the edge, you're not exploring the possibility space. And then based on what you learn, you can bring it back into the mainstream. It's that which needs to be rewarded, not giving the next failure award or something like that. Okay, that's not the point. Failure is just, if you're at the edge, you will fail. Or if you go to a R&D lab and they say, okay, what are your projects? And they say, well, we have 10 projects. And you say, oh, okay, how are they doing? So all are doing very well. I say something is wrong. How can you be at the R&D and all your projects are doing really, really well? Either you're not pushing the boundaries, that means you're being very safe. That's something I would be worried about. But if someone says, out of these 10 projects, I think 2 or 3 may go somewhere, then you know that, okay, as long as they're not incompetent, right? Then you know that they're really pushing the boundaries. That's what you want to see, a healthy mix of exploration and development. And that's what we want to encourage in companies and in schools as well. Could you say the first question again, in terms of societies that are there?
The first question is basically society at large, which societies are actually in the process of embracing adaptive failure, in a sense.
I don't know. They're just experimental studies done in different places. I can just give you some kinds of stories, for example, in Singapore, it was actually surprisingly positive experience, based on what one might think. Okay, I don't know how sensitive this is, but in Australia, when we tried, people didn't like the term. So we had to do productive failure without calling it productive failure. So they have very strong notions about. And everywhere else has been a mixed bag as well. So I think once you help people understand what exactly you're trying to do, you're not saying failure is okay. That's not the message. The message is if you're learning something new, let's change the assumption that the best way of learning something new is for me to directly tell you. And it's paradoxically, if you design failure in that initial learning, where people invent ideas and they don't reach the correction, that is very powerful for learning. And that's what we want to signify. And people get that. People understand that. Most places, it's not a problem. Culturally, if you're asking whether some societies are more open to failure, yes, we all know that, right? There's the usual stereotypes that we don't need to go into.
I could also chime in on that. During my time around Silicon Valley, I know that Stanford University's design science program, they like to talk a lot about try fast, fail fast, reiterate, and that's sort of their secret sauce to entrepreneurship. So I think Silicon Valley is definitely an example where we can learn from. There's another question here.
Hi, I'm Jeffrey, NUSS member. I think my question will be this. As I think most are aware, Singapore actually has an aging population, right? So like older people, I think many of us are also above 50, and also about continuous education. So my point is there any difference? Will your approach be different? Say, for example, I mean, we have talked about maybe home kids and, you know, people who are working, trying to get more educated, trying to get more stuff in the head. How about those that are after retirement and then, you know, so I go for this course and all that? How would that approach be different for you when you're talking about productive failure?
So we don't have research in that area, which is why I painted that picture, embodiment, as a framework to look at learning and health and aging and psychological aspects, mental health as well, as a framework to pursue precisely this kind of research. We don't have data on that. And the point is, it has to be done together. You cannot just, I mean, you can, but I think you'll derive greater benefits for a holistic outcome if you look at learning and health and aging and other areas together. But that research needs to be done. And I think the NRF in Singapore has put out a program on health and human potential. That is exactly in the right direction.
I love this question from online. You mentioned that one part of learnability is resourcefulness. But how does productive failure work when students are resourceful but simply Googling many things or, you know, passively asking for help the minute they have a problem?
Right, great question, very insightful. So one of the things that's not allowed in the productive failure is that kind of resourcefulness. Because that's not consistent. I cannot let you get to the correct answer so quickly, right? So that is completely taken away. Yeah. But resourcefulness in terms of using tools to explore, you know, charting things, looking at trends, doing computation, talking to people, interacting with experts, all that is allowed. Provided, I mean, and when we do that, we tell teachers, and when we work with them, do not tell them the answer. Teachers are very helpful people. They want to help immediately. I'll give a hint. He says, no, withhold. Let the burden of cognition remain on the student for a while, you know, and I think that's how it works.
I think something we need to learn as teachers and as parents.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I think there's another question right here.
Yeah, sorry, I'm asking a question a second time. To what extent, I mean, you've mentioned that a lot of the data you collected were based on volunteers within your school community. To what extent were these people who volunteered already highly motivated, highly capable, and therefore to a certain extent skewed the outcomes of the study?
Oh, absolutely. That's a problem in any voluntary participation. That could be a retort to any study that we do in behavioral sciences. You know, you recruit, and the motivations of the recruitment obviously confound it. Now the question is, if you can replicate it in different contexts, with different age groups, in different cultures, in different environments, and all of these replications in a meta-analytic way are suggesting a strong trend, then you know there's something more than just the motivation of people that's producing the effects. Which is why replication across contexts is so important. You know, and if you know the replication crisis in science, research in psychology is especially notorious. You know, by some accounts, only, how much is the picture? 2 to 5% of psychological research actually replicates. And to think that we managed to replicate it in so many experimental comparisons means there is something more than that. More than just the motivation of recruitment or participants that explaining that.
Fortunately, I think there's newer meta-analysis showing that it's a little bit more than that. But you're right, that generally a lot of medical studies, psychological studies, you know, research in general, sometimes lacks robustness.
Mm-hmm.
There's another question. Yes, the lady at the back.
Yes, please. I'm Kim from NUSS. Do you have any studies which correlates this, your recommendation or the model, to, you know, the AQ, adversity quotient measurements? Because I think in the corporate world, most of us do use IQ and EQ measurements quite a bit. Thank you.
The short answer is no. We don't use adversity quotient in our I mean, we measure other aspects of motivation and interest and so on and so forth. We look at attitudes towards failures and mistakes, but in a psychometric way, but not precisely that quotient, adversity quotient.
Here's another question that's sort of taking a slightly different route. A lot of learning and character development takes place outside of curriculum in a school, like co-curricular activities. How would you structure the concept of productive failure within the CCA domain, and is it applicable?
That's a great question. If somebody wants to do a PhD and mount a program in that, let's do it. Yeah, like I said, the bulk of my research is focused on STEM domains. There's some research on non-STEM domains and domain general skills, where we're finding it's not that effective. But yeah, in CCAs, we have not done any research. There is some research in physical education, learning physical skills. So how do you learn how to kick a football or something like that? And there are some results that are consistent with, I would just say consistent with productive failure findings, but not exactly that. So that's an area that, yeah, that's something we could look at.
Wonderful. On that note, I think it's time for us to stop. So thank you so much, Professor Kapur, for taking all these excellent questions.
No, thank you for asking them. Thank you.
Once again, thank you, Prof Manu, as well as Dr. Chen, for a very engaging and interactive Q&A session. Thank you for attending this evening's lecture. We look forward to seeing you for future events. But before you leave, please make sure that there's no mingling and maintain social distancing. Thank you very much, and good evening to all of you.